All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are going to go ahead and get started. This is Breaking Barriers, Affordable Housing Innovation Across the DMV. So, as we all know, I think housing affordability is an issue nationwide. DC is actually one of the most expensive metro regions to live in the nation. The National Low-Income Housing Coalition calculates that to afford a 2-bedroom rental here, you need to make at least $39.33 an hour, or at minimum wage, you need to be working at least 90 hours a week. And so, housing affordability is a crisis here in the district and in the region. And I think, as many know, there's no one quick fix, there's no one easy answer to the problem. But there's a lot of interest in figuring out innovative solutions that can contribute to lessening the burden on families, and that can contribute to making sure that community members here in the region can stay in the region and can be less burdened by the amount of rent or by the cost of living in their situation. So we are joined here today by 3 really wonderful and excellent individuals who are knowledgeable about different layers to this conversation. And so we're going to be talking about a variety of different programs and policies and how those help contribute to more affordability or just more available housing here in the DMV. So immediately to my left is Tina Nelson. She is a managing attorney at Legal Counsel for the Elderly, where they help to manage something for the district known as the DC Heirs Property Program. I'm going to let Tina speak more about that program specifically, but wanted to highlight that that's one particular program that she's able to mention for us today. And her work, though generally, is also in their economic and healthcare security practice, where the variety of her work is on behalf of low-income older persons who reside in DC. Next to Tina is Mike English. Mike is a Montgomery County housing land use advocate, and he's focused both on solving a housing shortage and on tenants' rights. And he's also a steering committee member for Montgomery for All. And then last but not least is Alex Baca, who is the DC Policy Director at Greater Washington. She was previously the Engagement Director at Coalition for Smarter Growth and the General Manager of Cuyahoga County's Bike Share System, and has also worked in journalism, bike advocacy, architecture, construction, and transportation in DC, San Francisco, and Cleveland. So I'm going to turn it now to let our panelists tell you a little bit about one particular issue or kind of some highlights that they wanted to give you about their work or about things happening in the region. So I'm going to turn it to Tina first to tell you about the DC Heirs Property Program.
Thank you, Leighann. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Tina Nelson. I'm a senior managing attorney with Legal Counsel for the Elderly. And in terms of affordable housing in DC, one of the things that we do at LCE in terms of tackling and handling this problem is through our probate and estate planning project here at LCE. And through that project, we assist clients in probating estates of family members who have passed on and transferring title into their names. So we think that this is very essential in terms of tackling the issue of affordable housing here in DC, because once a family loses their home, oftentimes that means that they are actually displaced from DC and they're displaced from the community. So through our heirs property work, which is basically when we're assisting seniors in probating estates when there was no will that was prepared by the person who passed the title owner to the property. And so DC, like other states, have lists of heirs who are entitled to receive that property. And so for the many of the cases that we handle at LCE, we assist those heirs in going through the probate process for the purpose of transferring title and keeping the heirs housed and living here in the community in DC. We know that the issue of gentrification is a major problem, and what our probate and estate planning project tries to do is to make sure that communities of color are able to keep and maintain their housing here in the District of Columbia. Many of our clients are living in homes because they're titled in their parents' names or grandparents' names, and so the house has been in the family for numerous years. And because of gentrification, the value of the property has increased greatly, which is a great thing. But on the other hand, as the value of the property increases, so do the property taxes. And a lot of our seniors find themselves at risk of losing their homes, their family homes, because they can no longer afford the taxes that come with living in properties that are in Capitol Hill and other areas of DC that have gone through major gentrification. And so again, our focus at LCE is to assist those seniors so that they can go through the probate process, they can have conversations with mortgage companies, with the Office of Tax and Revenue, as the person representative for the estates, as we go through the process with them of completing probate, settling the estate, and then titling that property in their names, again, to keep them housed, stabilizing both the family and the community, and making sure that there is some solution in some ways that we can address the problem of affordable housing here in DC.
Thank you. Mike English. Yeah, wear a few hats, including my steering committee member for Montgomery for All. And the three other groups, just, as is usually the case, and as is today, I'm speaking only in my own capacity, but three other groups, I'm also like the resident lapsed Catholic of Jews United for Justice housing team in Montgomery County, and both of those orgs are members of Renters United Maryland, which pushes more is a little more focused on tenants' rights at the state level. But what sort of brought me to the work was that, I grew up in suburban Connecticut. I live in downtown Silver Spring now. We don't have to go very far to be in places much like where I grew up in suburban Connecticut. And long story short, I have spent most of my life around other fellow well-meaning progressives that were well-meaning so long as it asked nothing of changing their own neighborhood or asked anything of them. And it got, what got me to go to one meeting in early 2020 was there was a housing moratorium type of school usage that banned apartments, anything like that being built near me, and just kind of went from there. So some things that have happened in Montgomery County high level. We passed a general plan which this is 20, 50 years ago, doesn't change any specific zoning, but is the document that the planning department and the county council need to reference and be in alignment with when they pass master plans or zoning text amendments that do change the zoning. We recently passed a rent stabilization bill that the regulations for were just sent to the county council and will hopefully be enacted in the next few months. There is a missing middle housing bill that's coming up now to allow duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, a few places. And then on the state level, I bring this up because it came up in the other panel where it doesn't work. I'm not as familiar with DC's law, but there's so it's the rent escrow process we're talking about withholding rent, what have you. It's the Tenant Protection Act passed, which basically makes it easier for tenants in one property that have the same issue, whether it's it's an elevator or something that affects more than one unit. They used to have to go through a big process to file escrow separately, which is the process of having a court-administered account hold your rent rather than go to the landlord. It makes it easier for them to file that collectively. And then a big thing that's really pushed forward is just cause, or sometimes they're good cause evictions, which is essentially there needs to be a stated reason of licit allowance or a just cause for a lease not to be renewed. And that can be a loophole that a lot of tenants can be. If you form a tenants association, sometimes you're not offered a renewal, and that's not necessarily a coincidence. So those are some things we're working on.
Hello. So my name is Alex Baca. I'm the DC Policy Director of Greater Washington. GGWash is a 501c3, C4 organization. We're based in DC. We do work in Maryland and a little bit of work in Virginia. We're not a direct service provider. We're an advocacy organization. We started in 2008 as a volunteer-run blog writing about housing and transportation, and have grown into a more formalized nonprofit since then. So my role to advocate basically means to support, right? So we're issue area advocates, and we work on housing, transportation, and land use. So for the purposes of this conversation, the housing component that we focus on is primarily housing production, right? There's a lot of different housing policies out there. Some of them include the heirs property program. Some of them are closer to tenants' rights. Some of them are just affordable housing production and how to put together a pro forma and where that funding is coming from. Where we're looking is at land use regulations that make it easier to build housing, particularly in places where it has not been built in the past. So in DC, we really like to look at Ward 3, Rock Creek West, sort of upper northwest especially, but also Ward 4, also parts of Ward 5. So there's a lot of other, I do want to say that like DC has some really fantastic like housing organizations that work really closely with tenants, that work really closely on affordable housing production, specifically of income restricted and subsidized housing. We try to work alongside them as peers, and so that we can all sort of work on what we're best on, right? So we take our lane on production, but occasionally we will cross over into supporting tenants' rights. We spend a lot of time on rent control and stabilization over the past couple of years trying to make expand the program in DC, stuff like that. But because we're not a direct service provider, we're not working specifically with a program that someone would come to, either the district government and we would administer the program, or would come to us and we would connect them to something. Again, we're an advocacy group, and that often means organizing our base of supporters. Mike's a great one, to show up to things to support, whether that's a zoning change or a new development or whatever. But it also means working really closely with the DC Council, working really closely with the DC government to understand what they are working on, how we can be supportive to advance our shared goals. The district has a housing production goal. According to the mayor, she's going to meet it next year. That's great. We still don't have enough housing for everyone in Washington, D.C. So one of our big asks is taking another look at what the existing housing supply is, how much it needs to be increased by, what income bands need to be served the most. I think you can guess what those bands are. It's not 120% area median income. At the same time, we are seeking sort of housing built across the income spectrum. So a big component of my work over the next few years will be on the district's comprehensive plan. Many people don't know what a comp plan is. That's fine. The district has one. It is the foundational land use document. It dictates where things go, how big they will be, when they will get built over time. This is something that gets rewritten every 10 to 15 years. It will be rewritten in 2025. We'll be working on that to try to push the inclusion of more housing and more dense housing in low density neighborhoods, especially ones that have not built their fair share of housing over time. So that's my job for the next 6 years. But in the meantime, we also do a lot of work to both endorse candidates because we are a 501c4, we can take political action, work closely with advisory neighborhood commissioners in Washington, D.C. Thank you to Leighann and Evan for your service, and other ANCs in the room. The sort of padding that goes around those overarching big deal advocacy pushes.
Thank you so much. Thank you each for explaining just facets of the many layers of this, right? Of how do we ensure that there is housing for people who live in DC? The goal here is to kind of have a conversation about the ways in which this interacts. So Tina obviously is talking about how do we keep people who are living in a home within that home, because that's obviously an affordable option, right? To stay somewhere where you already are. As Mike is explaining, zoning, what can be built and where is an important thing that Montgomery County is considering. And then as Alan was explaining, production matters, right? Because we know population goes up. And so how are we going to have enough places for people to live unless we're continuing to think about how do we create more? And so I wanted to drill down just specifically on some of the features that you all just mentioned. And so Tina, I want to start with you. I wanted to highlight, there's a report from the National Consumer Law Center called Keeping It in the Family that speaks to how heirs property programs can keep homes not only in families, but in homelessness, and specifically combat what you're mentioning, which is Black homeownership and combating the displacement of Black persons, which I think is, we all know, an incredible problem here in the district. So can you speak to what you've seen about the DC heirs property program and how it plays a role in that, whether generally or specifically?
Yeah, so we are, I guess, grateful, if you can be grateful about anything, that Mayor Bowser a couple of years ago identified heirs property as an issue here in the District of Columbia. And because of that, she put about $1 million in her budget to handle that issue. LCE was one of the organizations that received some of that funding to work on heirs property. And so we've been able to increase our capacity to assist low-income seniors here in the district with going through the probate process again for establishing title and transferring title to property. One of the problems that we have seen in terms of heirs property, which makes this a very sometimes hard issue to place, is when you have an issue of heirs property, again, that's when a person dies and there's no will that is leaving the property to a specific person, then the property goes to all of the heirs as identified by the district. And sometimes heirs don't agree on what should happen to a particular piece of property. And you may have an heir who, again, because you're in a property that's gone through gentrification and it's worth up to $1 million, they want to sell that property in order to get their percentage of their interest in the property. And so prior to last year, that heir who may have wanted to sell that property could go out to any third person and try and force a sale of the property so that they could collect whatever interest they had in the property. And there was no oversight over that process. But last year in 2023, DC passed the Partition of Real Property Act, and it increased some safeguards, and made some safeguards and increased some protections on other joint tenants and co-tenants in properties. And so now under the law, a person who is an heir can't just go out and try and sell their property to an investor who would just try to flip the property and then displaces the entire family. And generally because where there's a lack of affordable housing in DC, many of those families are often forced to move outside of the district. But under the new law, some of the protections include making sure that the other remaining co-tenants or joint tenants have the first rights of refusal to purchase that interest in the co-tenant who wants to share to sell their property. It also provides that anyone who seeks to try and force a sale, that the sale be done in a commercially reasonable fashion, and that the fair market value of the property is assessed. And because in the past, you may have an heir trying to get a quick buck, and so they are willing to lowball the house sale and get what they can. But under the new law, it has to be a fair market value of the asset, and there's some court oversight as well. So that has prepared some protections and some guardrails so that individual heirs are able to maintain that home ownership for the family members. Oftentimes we see that where you're going through probate, and again, because of family situations, you have one person trying to sell quickly. Because of the new law that exists in DC to address the issue of heirs property and increase the number of protections, we have been able to protect many of our low-income seniors and to ensure that they are able to maintain their home ownership so that they aren't displaced.
Thank you so much. Alex, I'm going to jump back down to you to explain how, talk about the ownership lens of this, about making sure we have affordability in the ownership market. Can you speak a little bit more to how, that the question of available existing stock matters to renters?
Sure. So the way that we define affordable housing, I think, matters tremendously. Gigi Wash uses the Office of Planning's definition, which effectively says that affordable housing is income restricted and subsidized. That means that someone is paying the difference between the market rate, whether that is like a tenant has a voucher from the government, or whether the developer has subsidized it as a requirement of the inclusionary zoning program, or there are other funds elsewhere in the sort of project's capital composition. But that means that there is some level of subsidy bringing down the cost of that unit. As the trade-off for that is that it's means tested, is that not everyone can access it. There's often a wait list, and that it is capped. I should have brought out my little chart of how much is 30% AMI, how much is 60% AMI, but it is capped at that. So everyone in this room would qualify for a variety of things and may not be able to live even in an affordable unit in a building because of that income restriction, not just because of the supply. That's what you get with means testing, right? But that is what we say we do to ensure that affordable housing goes to those who need it most. So there are some inherent contradictions in there, but that's how it works. That is the definition that we use. Everything else is market rate. Now that means that it might be cheap, it might be expensive, but it is, again, sort of what the market will bear, which is a phrase that I hate, but it is true. So I live on the first floor of a duplex in Parkview, right? I bought it with my partner. I feel very lucky to be able to own my home. I think that we got a great deal on it, right? It's affordable to us in the sort of vernacular term of affordable, but it's not what the district would define as affordable, right? Because it is just market rate and we just paid for it. We got a good deal on it. We could say it's cheap. We could say it's attainable to us. We could even say it's affordable, but it's not technically affordable by the definition that I just laid out. So I go through that just to be super clear that a lot of times it's easy to fuse together that we don't have enough affordable housing because housing is really expensive. That is totally true, but the production of affordable housing is a very separate process than the production of market rate housing, since it involves the collection of subsidies and usually negotiations with the government over what subsidy the government may provide. So in DC, that is done through our Housing Production Trust Fund, which took some cuts in the budget recently, but that is our primary local mechanism for funding the production of affordable housing. That often is paired with federal low-income housing tax credits, which are dispersed by the federal government to local jurisdictions. They are not direct subsidies, they are tax credits. This is how we build affordable housing in America. The government doesn't build housing, it doesn't directly subsidize it, unless local jurisdictions make the choice to do that. Vouchers, then whether they are local or federal, can be paired with those units to bring down costs even further. So that is very different than just someone builds a building, regardless of what those units cost. A prospective tenant walks in, makes enough money to qualify for those units, signs a lease, and can move in whenever the apartment is ready, right? Those are two very different systems. One of them is the affordable housing system, one of them is the market rate system. Again, I have a lot of experience with it, that is how it works. So to answer Leighann's question, which I kind of forgot what it was at this point, but that felt like a necessary preamble to sort of say that whether you are renting or buying, right, even if you qualify for an income-restricted subsidized unit, you may not get into that, and your preferred option may be the market because you may be able to walk into a building and rent a unit or into a home and buy it, but that is contingent on how much money you make. So the sort of split here is how greatly are we either able to subsidize things, cool off the market, or give people enough money to buy their homes, which may just then raise the cost of housing overall. So it is really like prisoner's dilemma territory and not a particularly fun one. As a homeowner, I think there is a lot that we load into the myth and stability of homeownership. I would love to see just more flexible and realistic terms for renters, whether that be signing multi-year leases with the agreement to like one flat rate over that period of time could be a huge asset. At the same time, the district does have some of the strongest tenant protections in the country, even if they are not sufficient, right? So the ability to just flip to a month-to-month lease without re-signing a lease is very powerful. Our rent control policy, every time that I talk about it, I am grateful for its simplicity. It is CPI +2 for buildings older than 1976. That should certainly be updated. It is a much better way to handle rent control than our friends in New York who mediate individual units through a rent board. Right, so there are some things that work super well for tenants here. I'm very proud of them. I think they need to be expanded. That can set people up to become homeowners at some point. I would also love it if culturally we did not place the emphasis on homeownership in a term of value and sort of judgment in some ways. It is, renters are deeply involved in their communities. Again, rent stabilization is a really powerful tool for that. I benefited from a rent stabilized unit for a long time. And I think, we should, in the terms of both providing more options through housing production, providing more options through more flexible policies for renters is really critical. It sort of pairs with production, although it's not entirely related to that, but it's something that we definitely view in our work at GGWASH as just part of the same scope.
Thank you so much for that. Alex, I want to pick up on something that you mentioned, which is DC's Housing Production Trust Fund, right? Which is a fund that the district uses to fund the production of what you call the traditional label of affordable housing, right? Ones that are specifically targeted at persons, making less than the area median, making less than the average income, right, in our area. And I want to ask Mike to talk a little bit about what the Housing Opportunities Commission of Montgomery County has done recently, which is, it's gotten a lot of national press, folks may or may not be aware, but I wanted him to be able to highlight kind of what they've done to create more affordable housing in Montgomery County.
Yeah, absolutely. I do that, and I think I can circle back. It dovetails a lot with what Alex said as well. But yeah, the Housing Opportunities Commission has, I think, Housing Production Fund is the title for it, and it's a thing that I like to see scaled up, and there's actually some indication that some other partners, like Montgomery Housing Partnership, which is more traditional affordable housing, can use it. What essentially it is sort of, there's something here called mixed income housing or social housing. These are terms that don't have like strict definitions that everyone agrees on, so you'll hear it called a few things. But basically there's a mix of market rate and below market rate units. And the county puts forward money from a revolving fund to invest in them, and then basically they often partner with the developer, and then some of the returns of that are then rolled over into the fund to proceed to more housing. And it actually got the allocation went up. I unfortunately don't remember the number off the top of my head, but it was a significant increase. It got right up in the New York Times. There's been a lot of discussion about it, and it really is a way that, circling back to what Alex was saying, where these lines aren't necessarily as clear, just because they need to be. Like, if you're gonna have an affordable housing program with cutoffs, you need an income cutoff if you're gonna meet this test, whether that's good, bad, or whatever, it's a difference. So, what is affordable, what is not, this is sort of marrying the two. And another thing Montgomery County has is it's an inclusionary zoning program, the moderately priced dwelling unit, MPDUs, and those are, depending on, a lot of specifics, it depends on, you don't want them to be so high that they tempt down, 10% of 100 is more than 20% of 0, right? So it's like they have to be there. But one thing they're very good for is making sure that when homes are built in a more expensive area, a certain percentage of them are available to people that would not otherwise be able to afford that area. They have a very good integration component as well. And I say all that to say that a lot of this is a way to make housing affordability 100% affordable. Low-income housing tax credit buildings are great, but you don't want people to be put there and walled off and in parts of the community where I spend a lot of time talking with people who talk about, redevelopers, this and that, and there's never truth to that, but a lot of people that say that to me are living in $900,000 single-family homes, saying that they don't, and those people are not going to sell their house for less than that, right? And that's fine. But this is a way to make sure that those affordable homes are in higher resource communities and around other people in the neighborhood. One thing I did want to circle back with Alex is you touched on with what defines affordable. So there's also the Metropolitan Washington Area Council of Governments, MWCOG, sets affordable housing targets that Montgomery County, I believe DC and others also have. And they're not binding, but they do set a goal that government's supposed to meet. Most of us are behind on them. DC's is meeting, but in an inconsistent way from word to word, I would say. But Montgomery County is not meeting theirs. But the affordability threshold there is, I believe it's affordable to, it's like 70 to 120% of area median income, something like that. So it is not an income restricted definition there. And it does sort of, I think, recognize that, I would call it like a kitchen sink approach, like you need everything. I'll try to wrap up with one thing I like to talk about is there's two principal ways renters can have leverage. One is to have protections, whether it be some of the ones we talked about, rent stabilization, tenant associations, tenant operator purchase, all of that. Another is to have other places you can go and have options to rent, and both of those really are needed for leverage. That's a big part of it.
Thank you so much. I want to give an opportunity to jump in if anyone had anything else to comment on what someone else has already said.
Well, I just want to comment on what Alex and Mike said, and the importance of, so if you are lucky enough or fortunate enough to be able to find a home that's affordable to you, it's imperative that you be able to keep that home and that you be able to pass that home down to your generations. It creates generational wealth within families, within communities that you can tap into as an asset to get loans, get grants. So once you're able to get the home, you know, one of the problems with heirs property is when people don't go through proper life planning is you risk losing that home when you die and you haven't passed it on either through a will or a transfer of death deed that exists here in DC. Because again, you get the situation where you don't know who the house is going to go to, and you fall in the issue and the problems with the heirs property where there's so many heirs because there's no person identified in the will to receive the home. And then if heirs move out of the property, move out of the area, then trying to locate all the heirs, they may have moved to the south, to the west, and you're trying to find these people. And the process of finding heirs is necessary because you have to have everyone who has an interest in that property participate in the conversation about what we're going to do with this family home. And so that creates another problem as well. And so it can tie up title for years, and that home that you've spent time and sweat and years and dollars to receive, you've been able to stop renting and save up enough to buy a home, you could risk losing that home simply because you haven't gone through the process of ensuring that when you pass on, there's someone particular that you're giving that property to.
Thank you so much, Philippa. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I will save my conversations for our opinions on this mayor later, but I do find it nice and symbolic that the heirs property program became a priority at the same time that housing production did. And I don't think heirs property gets like the sort of fanfare sometimes as housing production, but knowing that like clear title is just incredibly challenging and is painstaking work is like, it is important to have ongoing support for that. So I'm very grateful to LCE for like work on that. Because I can't do that, I don't have a law degree. So I did just want to add that it is meaningful to see multiple different types of programs sort of emerge at the same time. And sometimes it gets lost that there are ongoing efforts in different tracks of like housing policy.
Yeah, and just to jump on both of those, like, and I talked a little bit about, like, and you were talking about gentrification and displacement, which is, absolutely is a real concern. But there's also a lot of reasons programs like that are important, not just for the good they do, but a lot of, if I would talk about people who are opposed to whether it's a new apartment or a condo building or a townhome or whatever in the neighborhood, like, there are some that are just straight up nefarious, classist people, and those exist, and but it's by and large not my experience of what is driving those people. There's some level of fundamental fear of change, and a lot of that comes from this idea that, well, if this comes here, I'm going to be pushed out of my home, and that can happen with tax situations. We have, like Montgomery County has a homestead tax credit that sort of caps how much appreciation affected. There's tools that can help with that, but a lot of it too is just sort of the more emotional feeling of, this place is no longer for me, and it's, it used to be this working class neighborhood, and now it's something else. And depending on the neighborhood, it can be the case that that problem is going to accelerate if those alternatives are not allowed, if smaller, denser, cheaper homes are not allowed there. And marrying those two things, it can seem counterintuitive. You see a big new luxury building, and it looks luxurious, but if you actually do the math on what the rent on that building costs, it's actually much, much less than buying that home costs, even if you manage to have a 20% down payment, which in Montgomery County for the average, the average median detached home price in Montgomery County is just short of $1 million. The median is, I think, $760,000. So I mean, you're very quickly getting to large six-figure down payments. So it's people, that instinct of I want to feel still at home in my neighborhood isn't wrong. We just need to find a way that can come together. And the easiest way to do that is to block things. And it doesn't actually accomplish that. And that's what a lot of what I try to do is to show that's actually not happening.
Thank you all so much, and thank you all for being here. I wanted to kind of just summarize again that we all know this is not an easy answer, right? That being able to have housing available to all looks like a lot of different things, right? And all the things that Alex mentioned about the different types of affordable housing, like the actual label of building affordable housing that's meant to target folks of a lower income, is important, as is the things that we talked about that are about just general production of housing that's available to people in the market who may not be the upper end of the market, right, but who are the average portion of the market. And we didn't really get to talk about the missing middle studies, but Montgomery County's done one, and there's one happening in Virginia to talk about how do we make sure that there's housing for people who are there in the middle, right, who are not targeted with affordable housing programs and are not, able to, keep up with the rat race of what housing costs, and is growing to cost in the market, but who are just, the average citizen, the folks here in the middle, and there are efforts being made to study and figure out how do we continue to offer housing to those folks. And again, bring it back to this idea of how do we keep people housed who have been here, whose families have been here for generations, right? And how do we make sure that we keep housing that is affordable to them, because they already have it, continuing to belong to them. And so I do want to offer opportunity to ask questions if there are some, but what I wanted to ask each of you last was, sitting here today, forward-looking, is there a thing that we've talked about or that we've not talked about, that you think is important for people to know about or that you want to see happen? I'll just kind of go down the line. I'll start with you.
Sure. So again, if you're fortunate because you already have a home that you own, or you're fortunate in the future to be able to purchase a home, the most important thing is to make sure that you keep that home, and that you're able to transfer that home down to your heirs. And the best way to do that is to engage in life planning. So you really do need to create a will in which you identify person or persons that you want to get your property after you pass, because that kind of counteracts the problems that I've identified with regards to heirs property. In the District of Columbia, there's a simple way to do that. It's called a transfer and debt deed. There are about 13 states in the country that allow you to identify a beneficiary or beneficiaries to whom you want to get your property, your real property, after you pass, and those individuals can get your property without having to go through probate. Probate can be time-consuming, it can be very expensive. It's a very emotional time because you're already grieving the loss of a family member or a loved one, and now you have to deal with all of this paperwork in the courts to get, this house that your grandmother or your mother promised you. But if you go through the process of preparing a transfer and debt deed, that takes that real property outside of the probate process, and you're able to make sure that that person that you want to get your home is able to get your home after your death, and then they're able to do the same thing. And so we are able to build up generations of families who are able to keep and maintain and transfer and pass down not only the home, but the equity that is built up in the home. They can leverage that home. If you need to get a loan to send your children or your grandchildren to college, there's so much that you can do just by being a homeowner. And so that's one of the cautions I would say. Make sure you engage in life planning. Get your will, get your powers of attorney documents, get the transfer and debt deed so that you ensure that the family home stays in the family, and then your generations that come after you are able to leverage the asset and the equity to benefit of your future.
That first of all, agreed on all of that. I actually need to do some of that myself. I'm gonna cheat a little bit in that, like, it's basically, one thing I want people to keep in mind is that it's not just one thing, which I think everyone would agree on. All of our focus here, but and I'm stealing this term from somebody. I want to say Shane Phillips, who's a California-based housing advocate, but the supply and subsidy and stability, right? And they all, so it's supply of, most people live in market rate housing and do, and that's supply and demand does apply, even if not always cleanly, right? Subsidy, which is people who can't afford market rates, all that, and stability. Some of the DC's law, Montgomery County's law are different. I think they both are good. But all that to say that a lot of times, because of the political nature of this area, and this is not a complaint, like it's all very intra-left fighting and discussions and things that happen. And I think to say, for the most part, people who are proposing different policy solutions, one or the other, agree on more things than we disagree on. And things can be treated as if they're in conflict, where they don't inherently need to be. That doesn't mean that a stabilization law crafted a certain way can't have a certain impact here, or that certain housing built of a certain type can't have impact somewhere else, right? But it does mean that all of them work better when they're considered together. And I think there is a lot of well-meaning people aren't really trying to do it, but there's a lot of this is the one way to do it, and that one way does not exist. The problem is too big. So, yeah.
I would say one thing that you should know is if you're a DC resident, that the comp plan will be rewritten beginning in 2025. You may or may not participate in this process. I think it's great if you do. I also think it's okay if you don't. That will be run by Office of Planning. It will be a government process. But the point of doing that will be to guide change in the district and explicitly change. I think there's absolutely value in preserving neighborhoods, but where we are currently, we don't have enough housing supply of affordable, income-restricted, subsidized, affordable, or market rate housing to meet our needs. The comp plan is the big shot to change that. That means neighborhoods will look different, laws will change. We went through an amendment process with this a couple of years ago. The fights are very fractious, they're very painful. There has been change since then. There is housing being built as a result of that. I think that's a positive thing. It's not sufficient. So that is going to be an ongoing conversation for quite some time. Comp planning is a little bit trendy right now in national planning circles. I hope that the district is a model for other jurisdictions. So that's my job, I guess. But Gigi Watch was always available to talk about that if you have anything. Not about your role though, so sorry.
Thank you all so much. I know that we're running close on time, but I did want to pause to see if we had any questions from anyone in the audience. Yes, sir.
Hey, how y'all doing? Thank y'all for sharing everything y'all talked about. So I'm displaced from California, and we dealt with, I think you mentioned the gentleman, I'm probably going to look him up, but we dealt with the flood, fires, civil arrests, and then I would be coming back home, and then we'd run into January 6th and these different catastrophic events. I'd be curious to understand how have any of your organizations worked in terms of maybe supporting those kinds of individuals or entities, right? We were actually converting school buses into houses in California, but what kind of happens is you're dealing with these exigent circumstances. You're not an entity, you just respond to a situation, and then you have to kind of clean it up on the back end. And I think we're all probably dealing with that in the context would be January 6th and COVID. It's kind of like the scenario that I think all of us probably have in common. But yeah, just be curious to hear how has that process or experience been when you think about applying that waivability or those alternative procedures in the work that you do. Does that show? Is that a thing in the district? Is there any synergy between your organizations, the emergency management service in Department of Homeland Security and FEMA, or am I just is that an unrealistic ask in a sense, right? Does that not exist here in the district?
I'm happy to jump in and say, I think that's a great question, right? Like housing supply and availability can also be impacted by major life-changing events that affect a lot of us. I will note specifically on the individualistic side of it, we have so many great service providers in the tabling area who do work with people's individualized situations, talking about displacement and specifically can help think about ways to connect to whether it's related to a FEMA type situation, things like that. And I know that they're tabling here on both sides, and I think that those would be great resources who can speak to, I guess, generally the ways in which there are people on the ground in DC who can help people get connected to figure out which programs and which types of assistance apply to them, and helping find which innovative program it is that's going to be to support an individual.
Yeah, just to add similar for, and I appreciate the question, to both organizations and me personally, I'm just not, through my advocacy work, I know a lot of tenant lawyers and advocates and things like that, and to the degree I have a role in it is sometimes people send me a question, I would there's an intake form where Economic Opportunity Maryland, I think, they used to be Maryland Fair Housing, they recently changed it, I think it's Economic Opportunity Maryland, as an intake form, there will be, basically that, there are tenant groups, there are government offices, there are liaisons, that role is to do that, and often I find my job to be hey, I think this, you really do need, people, I've had people say hey, I think I should withhold my rent, please do not do that on Maryland. Please go talk to a lawyer, do this. It gets complicated fast, and you really do need an organization that specializes in that, so.
I'd like to share, just for context, and thank you for speaking. I've spoken to most of these organizations. I'm an entity. I'm not just an individual, right? Like, because we were building houses, we were considered to be a commercial. So you're supposed to work with the CEO. 95% of the CEOs I find that I spoke or reached out to, because you have to have that to go to HUD. I just be curious to understand, like, what is the process in terms of like maybe working with the CEO specifically around displacement and disaster assistance in this city that I just don't. And I'm not knocking enough. I think this is just a beautiful way to kind of have a conversation about it. But definitely have taken that path, and we're not gonna be shock floods, storms, all these things moving forward. It's just I just was curious to see if there were any organizations kind of preparing the intake processes, things like that, to support those kinds of.
So I can respond to this in the answers pretty much now, for which I apologize. Partially this is, I used to live in California, but also partially like, when you are dealing with this, what you're describing is often a like government to government conversation as you're discussing, right? So one recent example is the sort of much bandied about border states busing migrants to places, right? And so the way that DC handled that didn't really have, like, we needed to change the law, right? So that was a partnership between like the mayor and the council to change the law to enable migrants to access the vouchers and other services well before any CBOs got involved. So of course, like that passed, and then that happened. But our CBO landscape is a little bit different than in other jurisdictions for like reasons that include us not being a state, that also like include just like the history of community development block grants and how they were dispersed and stuff like that. I generally think it's a better thing that our government tends to do things that CBOs and other places do. I'm very proud of that. But that does mean a lot of what you're talking about, like, does go through the district government initially before it gets to advocacy groups, and then as is typical, is contracted out. So like there is a chance that some of what you're talking about may actually be handled by HCMA in DC. But the landscape is a little bit different than other places, and it's just happy to talk more about that later.
It's actually through the Resilient Housing for All revolving loan fund, and this is what you have to have a CBO to go through. So
yeah, I gotcha. I think this is a sidebar conversation. So.
Sure, right. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you all so much for being here and participating. And like I said, I do want to highlight that, as Alex mentioned, you can reach out to Greater Washington if you're interested in policy advocacy and helping to be more involved about the planning process and like learn more. They do a bunch of great writing on these issues and helping break down very complex topics to help people be informed and know how to get involved in like DC's comprehensive housing plan. And I want to note that Legal Counsel for the Elderly does have a table over up here to my right. When you exit the auditorium, if anything that you spoke to is something that you're realizing you need more information on, I'm sure we'd be glad to help you out. And Mike, I'm sure, is available to talk about the wonderful work that Montgomery County is doing, but also just know that looking into any of the various committees that Mike is on, as well as the Housing Opportunities Commission of Montgomery County, is a good place to start in figuring out what are the affordability options out there. I will say that the Housing Opportunities Commission has a really accessible website that kind of explains the different programs that Montgomery County has.
Yeah, and just quickly, the county also has, you can go on and there's email subscriptions you do, and it'll let you know when MPDUs are available, when things like that. There's, dozens and dozens of options, and that's a good way to stay in loop on those too. So. Just
wanted to highlight that those resources are available to folks. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and thank you so much for being here. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you.